If you're like me and grew up in the public school system, you may have been taught that language, reality, and truth are merely subjective, that there is no true meaning and therefore no true values and purpose in life. This is the philosophical illusion that most modern Westerners are born into without even knowing it. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, he attacks that very subjectivist philosophical system. But he doesn't begin his argument in a way that you may expect. In fact, he starts his abolition of subjectivism by discussing a particular green textbook that in his time was being used to teach children this dangerous postmodern philosophy. Lewis goes on to explain that men who adhere to this philosophy and adopt all of its inconsistencies don't merely exist in a constant state of confusion. No, they actually cease to be men altogether. He says that this ideology actually leads to a full-on abolition of man, the end of humanity itself. But to understand what Lewis is trying to tell us, modern people, you need to read his book along with another book written by the Oxford professor Dr. Michael Ward, author of Planer Narnia and many other books, an actor in a James Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. His book, After Humanity, is a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So I had a conversation with Dr. Ward, and we talked about C.S. Lewis, technology, postmodernism, artificial intelligence, contraceptives, and logical positivism. We discussed what happens when man denies objective reality and forfeits his nature and purpose, and we ask the daunting and pressing question of the modern age: what comes after humanity? I'm here with Dr. Michael Ward. I've had him on the podcast before. We talked about the Chronicles of Narnia, very interesting conversation. And today we're going to be talking about The Abolition of Man, one of C.S. Lewis's books. A lot of people know about this book, but it's a small book, but it's very complex and it says a lot in a short amount of pages. And so I thought I'm going to have Dr. Ward on. We're going to talk about it. You wrote a book called After Humanity. It's a guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, a phenomenal guide, very, very helpful. I actually personally, if I ever recommended anybody to read The Abolition of Man, I feel like they almost have to read it with your book because it just helps so much. So before we actually get into talking about The Abolition of Man, I just first want to ask, so you could write about anything. You've written about the Chronicles of Narnia, and Lewis has a ton of things that you could write on. But why did you choose to write a guide to the abolition of man?
I was asked to. It's simple as that, really. A publisher got in touch and said, would I write a foreword? And that foreword grew and grew and grew into its own independent book.
Wow.
That was the main reason. But the reason I said yes to the invitation was that I saw the need for the book. I've been teaching the writings of C.S. Lewis for years now, and I've noticed how my students often struggle to get their mind round the abolition of man. And indeed, I have found it difficult myself because I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm more of a literary critic with theological interests, not really a philosopher. So I have struggled with it. And as I was writing the guide, I taught myself a great deal about what Lewis was up to and how this book, The Abolition of Man, works. It is a fantastic book. I mean, it's really important if you want to understand C.S. Lewis's whole approach to the world. But it's not easy. It's probably his most oblique and curious sort of work. He comes at the question of objective value from slightly odd angles, and therefore it does need a lot of unpacking.
Yeah, it definitely does. My wife and I have listened to the audiobook, and as I was reading and listening again to prepare for this interview, the one thing, because I'm 26 and I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, which is University of Wisconsin, very, very focused on postmodernism, relativism, subjectivism. Like there's objective, even if you say something's objective, people kind of look at you like there's something wrong with you where I grew up. So it feels like you really have to get your mind out of that, what you grow up in, and put it a different hat on or something, or get your mind into a different headspace to actually even approach this book. And it's very difficult because, like Lewis begins The Abolition of Man, he starts by discussing this little green book that is used for teaching children in school about English and literature. Lewis kind of doesn't really like this book, it seems like, and he begins a whole series of lectures with, I'm going to call it an attack on this book. I'm not sure if that's what you would call it, but an attack on this little green book because of how this book presents language and feelings and emotions and objective reality. And so can you just break down, like, what is this green book and why does Lewis begin The Abolition of Man by talking about a textbook for school kids?
Yeah, the Green Book is Lewis's own name for a book that was actually entitled The Control of Language. And he names its authors as Gaius and Titius, but in fact they were called Alec King and Martin Ketley. And the reason he masks the book, he doesn't call it by its real name or the authors by their real names, I think is because he doesn't really want to get into a deep critique of the control of language. He's just using it as a kind of springboard into his main argument, which is about whether value is objective or not. But in the Green Book, in The Control of Language, what gets his goat, what gets his dander up is that this book is supposedly a book about how you should do English prep, do English criticism, literary criticism. But it smuggles in a subjectivist point of view because Gaius and Titius, in discussing the famous occasion when the poet Coleridge was standing by a waterfall in England, there was a debate about whether the waterfall should be called sublime or pretty. And the authors, Gaius and Titius, say basically there is no correct answer. You might call it sublime, I might call it pretty, you might say potato, I might say potato. It's just a question of personal preference and whim and subjective perspective. There's nothing objective about the waterfall which would qualify it to be described as one way or the other. We make up reality according to what we want it to be. And if we say it is thus, it is thus. My truth is the truth. There is no such as there is no such thing as capital T truth, which we all have to approximate to as closely as we can. No, there's just many truths, and one is not any better than another. And so this is really red meat red flag to a bull as far as Lewis is concerned. And he goes charging in on Gaius and Titius and says, well, that is a massive philosophical question, which you can't just blithely assume has been settled in the way that you think. And especially when you're writing a book for young school kids, you ought not to act as if this massive philosophical question has been settled. This is one of the reasons why he finds it so annoying, that it's a way to condition the young children who are reading this book to assume that subjectivism is correct, and that's not right. Subjectivism needs to be argued for like any other philosophical position, and in fact, it's very, very weak. Not least because it is self-contradictory. Because if you say my viewpoint is just as good as your viewpoint, there is no such thing as objective value, well, haven't you just made a statement which you are implicitly suggesting is objectively correct. Because you're not saying, oh, I just happen to feel that value is subjective. You're saying, no, what I'm saying is that I'm saying something true when I say that value is subjective. In other words, I'm making an objective statement.
Right.
So it's undercutting itself. It's very hard, in fact, to live as a thoroughgoing and consistent subjectivist. But most of us in the 20th century, Lewis's 20th century, now our 21st century, most of us do actually adopt subjectivist viewpoints much of the time. And we don't see the self-contradictoriness of doing so.
Yeah, there's so many directions I think we could go here. One thing that I'm interested in what you have to say about is the subjectivists, and then like there's a logical positivism that he discusses in the book as well. That so they like there's an assumption of sort of the death of metaphysics, that we can just look at the physical world and that's all that we need. And one of the things, and I don't know exactly how to articulate this, so I guess work with me here. The very mechanism that they use to explain their philosophies, like using language and words. Do philosophers, theologians, do they consider language and words to be metaphysical themselves? And if language and words are metaphysical, then how could you even explain the death of metaphysics?
Very good point. You're quoting there from a famous book by A.J. Ayer, Freddie Ayer, who was an Oxford philosopher in the 1930s, who wrote a book called Language, Truth and Logic, which was, the sort of clarion call of what we now call logical positivism, at least in the United Kingdom. And he was one of the chief proponents of this subjectivism. Eventually, as it happens, just incidentally, it's worth recording that he changed his mind on it almost completely and said logical positivism was almost entirely wrong. But that didn't stop him from becoming very famous and probably fairly wealthy on the back of this very successful book. Now, what Freddie Ayer actually believed about the metaphysical nature of language when he wrote that book in 1936, I don't know. But you raise a good point that language is a very mysterious thing. It's not just verbal or auditory utterances coming out of our larynxes.
Right.
It is communication. It is a system of signifiers by means of which we make sense of the world. And when we say the sky is blue, we mean something by it, which is different from what we would mean if we said the sky is red. So these words have signification, and they describe the world truly or falsely, according to, not just C.S. Lewis, but most regular people. I mean, most of us, for all that we like to slip into subjectivism when it suits us, also are very keen to be objective about certain matters when it suits us in a different direction. So this is this is part of the slipperiness of the target that Lewis is trying to attack. But subjectivists say there is no such thing as objective value, but when you press into the Green Book, it turns out they do have quite a lot of values that they are implicitly propounding. It's just they don't recognize them as such.
So this is what's confusing to me. It's always been confusing about postmodernism or subjectivism, whatever we want to call this way of thinking. It's very confusing because these people are very smart people who are writing these books, way smarter than me. And they know, I can't imagine that they don't know that the very words that they're employing to describe and explain their philosophy contradicts their philosophy, which makes it feel like, and I'm not saying that this is what they're doing, but it feels like it's disingenuous and it feels like there's because I grew up in these schools where subjective like everything was subjective. That's how we were taught to write. That's how we were taught to think. That's how we were taught to speak. You can never tell somebody that something is totally, fully true, because that's oppressive or something like that. And so it feels like there's like a master plan that started a long time ago to sort of implicitly lull the culture into this contradictory ideology of subjectivism. But like the very way in which we use language totally contradicts that in every single day, which feels like it's causing mass confusion. That might be a huge statement. Do you have any thoughts on that? What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, you talk about a sort of plan to lull the culture into this viewpoint, and it did start a very long time ago. It didn't start with Freddie Ayer in the 1930s. Yeah. It basically started, if you want to be, theological about it, it started in the Garden of Eden.
Yes.
When the serpent says, did God really say you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? What he's implicitly, subtly, insidiously inserting into the mind of Eve before she takes the apple is a subjectivist viewpoint that God has pronounced something to be so, but you can disagree. You can make it what you want it to be. It wasn't really a command. There's nothing really dangerous about eating this fruit. I will declare my own viewpoint to be superior. In other words, you will step into a subjectivist mindset. But although I've immediately gone to the Bible and to a theological understanding of the question, it's important to point out that the abolition of man, Lewis's own argument, is not a theological argument. It's a philosophical one. He says at one point in the book, though I am myself a theist and indeed a Christian, I'm not attempting here any even theistic understanding of the question at hand. He leaves that aside. Questions of God, questions of Christianity don't come into this book. And that's one of the reasons why some readers who come to the abolition of man after having read Lewis's other more explicitly Christian works are a bit puzzled by it, because it doesn't advance its case on theological, religious, Christian grounds. It's purely philosophical. It's purely logical, purely reasonable. He's wanting to say that all people, whether they believe in God or Christ or not, should believe that value is objective, because this is one of the defining characteristics of our humanity. And if we give up on objective value, we will be undercutting our humanity. That's why he calls the book The Abolition of Man. This is where it will lead us. It will abolish our own humanity if we adopt a subjectivist viewpoint. And everybody ought to be able to agree on this, whatever their religious commitments. So in other words, he's working from, to step back into theology, what he's working from is what theologians would call natural theology, not revealed theology, not, this is general revelation available to all human beings. It's not particular or specific revelation through God in Christ, available through the Bible and the tradition of the church. No, this is a universal truth that everybody has access to because of their humanity, because all human beings have been created, again, we slip into theological language, have in them, let us say more neutrally, conscience. They have an awareness of good and evil, of right and wrong. And this is part of our inheritance as human beings. Who knows where it came from? I mean, Lewis actually believes it comes from the Christian God, but you don't have to believe in God, let alone the Christian God, to believe in conscience. And so it's interesting that in this country, in the United Kingdom, where I'm speaking to you from today, there's a very prominent contemporary philosopher called John Gray, and he gave a very interesting presentation on the abolition of man a few years ago on BBC radio, in which he said the abolition of man is a very prescient and prophetic work. It's as relevant now, if not more so, as it was when it first came out. And John Gray is an atheist.
Wow. Wow.
So that shows us that, Lewis's argument is something that an atheist or an agnostic or some person of other religion could get behind, because what he's trying to advance is a purely anthropological argument. This is what constitutes our humanity. This is what, in a sense, defines our species, that we are able rationally to understand value, recognizing it, not just imposing it upon reality, but seeing that it is there and trying to conform our lives to it. Whereas the animals, as far as we can tell, do not have beliefs in objective value. They are, as it were, lower than us in their capacity for understanding value. And the angels, assuming they're to be angels, I mean, Lewis doesn't get into this in The Abolition of Man, but angels are rational creatures, but they are purely spiritual intelligences. They don't have bodies. So they are not animal like we are. We are rational animals. We are that peculiar species which is halfway between the animal kingdom and the angelic realm. You have the angels, you have the anthropological, then you have the animal. And we human beings have bodies, senses, appetites, passions like the beasts do, but we also have the light of reason like angels do. And that is our unique place in the created order. And if we deny our ability to perceive objective value, then we will either be, as it were, evaporating upwards into pure spirituality, denying our carnal passions, which can be good or evil, or we are going to devolve downwards into pure animality, living on our passions and on our appetites, but without trying to reason about them. Whereas, in fact, we should combine both, and this is the glory of being a human being. We should combine what Lewis calls our belly, which he calls the seat of the passions. We should combine that with our head, the seat of rationality. We should combine those two elements in the chest. And it is the chest, he says, which is the liaison officer between cerebral man and visceral man. And that's where the two mingle and interact and should delight to be united. You shouldn't yoke your passions to your intellect like a criminal is handcuffed to a policeman. It's not a relationship of violence and domination. It should be much more like a marital relationship. The two become one. And that's why he opens his argument in The Abolition of Man with a chapter called Men Without Chests.
Right.
So the subjectivists, those who deny objective value, have given up on that liaison officer between the two departments of our humanity. And therefore, they're just flying upwards and downwards. But their central organizing, integrating principle, their chest, is no longer operative.
This is, I think, what's like haunting kind of about reading The Abolition of Man, because Lewis, like you just said, he's like, people who adopt this way of thinking, the subjectivist way of thinking, actually cease to be men. They cease to be human. And that's horrifying, because it feels like almost all of Western culture, if you had to think of a dominating philosophical presupposition for the modern Western culture, it would kind of be like subjectivists, postmodernists. And that's not good, because this is just chapter 1. And so he goes into like what happens because of this. But the importance of education and the way that he talks about textbooks and what we're teaching children. I think it's just something that people don't even really think about anymore. They send their kids to school. They kind of assume, things are probably going fine there. They're teaching them to read and things like that. But they don't understand that, like, if this is the presupposition, if this is kind of the unidentified social imaginary, or that's not really explained of the school and of the teachers and of the culture, you essentially, like, children grow up without even understanding the concept of the chest. And like Lewis wrote this, when did he write this? Was this in the 40s?
Yeah, 1943.
So that's a not like super long, but that's kind of a long time ago. And it doesn't seem like anything has really changed on the educational front from my perspective in the West. It almost feels like it's gotten worse. Like, first off, do you see that? Has it gotten worse or has it gotten better as education goes, especially for younger children, as it relates to reading and understanding language and words and having a chest? Has it gotten better or worse from your understanding?
Oh, much worse. Definitely.
Sure. Yeah.
No, we, I think, are much more inclined to be subjectivist today than we were in the 1940s.
So what do you do about that?
Pardon me?
So just what do you do about that from the educational standpoint? Because, like, it's such a dominating philosophy. How do you even overturn that? How do you upend that? How do you change that? Like, I know you're not the king of the world or of education, but what would you do if you were?
Yeah, well, what I would do is irrelevant. I'm here to talk about C.S. Lewis.
Sure.
I think C.S. Lewis, although the subtitle of The Abolition of Man is Reflections on Education with special reference to the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools, a snappy subtitle, if ever there was one. Although it's ostensibly a book about education given the subtitle, actually, it's really only the first chapter of the 3 chapters that is at all concerned in any very obvious way with education. Lewis is much more concerned with the underlying philosophical problem, subjectivism, and where it will lead if it goes unchecked. Specific pedagogical or educational remedies for subjectivism are not his main concern. He does write about education in a number of other places, right. But again, he always writes very generally. He's never a specialist in these matters, or hardly ever. The only syllabus he ever writes about with any specificity is the Oxford University English syllabus. But we're here talking about high schools and general education for people who won't ever end up at university. So his basic point when he's talking generally about education is that teachers will teach what matters to them. And indeed, what really counts with a teacher will be picked up on by the pupils, whether the teacher means that to happen or not, because children are not idiots. I mean, they may be younger, they may be relatively naive and easily led, but they're not completely imperceptive. And the main thing that a teacher communicates is their whole self, not just what they write on the blackboard or the whiteboard. So if a teacher is secretly subjectivist in his or her own attitude to the world, then the pupils will pick up on that.
Right.
And I think, this is a challenge, because all of us like to be subjectivist at times. This is a thing I sort of learned as I wrote my guide, that I found myself being challenged. How thoroughly do I really believe in the objective value of,
right.
Let's just give an example, truth-telling. Because at the end of the book, Lewis gives an example, excuse me, he gives an appendix of 8 moral values, such as our duties to the young and to posterity, or our duties to elders and antiquity, our duties of telling the truth, of justice, and so on. And he gives 8 such moral values, and then he gives citations from any number of different cultures and religions and traditions around the world, which show that this value has been adopted. And this is one of the ways in which he tries to support his case, that this is an anthropologically true thing that he's identifying, because you can find it exemplified across the world and down through history. And so he cites, Native American, Aboriginal Australian, ancient Egyptian, Judaic, Hindu, Christian, humanist, all these different sources testifying to the same basic understanding of these 8 key values. And that's one of the demonstrations that what he's saying is in fact the case. I mean, he's not denying that different traditions have different approaches to certain questions, but he's saying there's a massive degree of overlap. There's almost a monotonous unanimity about these key values. But when it comes to how we put those values into practice in our daily lives, well, you and I and everybody listening or watching this podcast will often squirm. We will make an exception in our own case, won't we? Because, sometimes it's very inconvenient to tell the truth.
Right.
And what's the harm in a little white lie? And, sometimes it's very inconvenient, say, to abide by your marriage vow when you find yourself attracted to another person. Do I really need to be chaste? And do I really need to be honest all the time, every time? Because that will make my life very difficult, won't it?
Right.
And so we tend to wriggle off the hook when it suits us, because we're effectively saying to ourselves, in this case, value is what I say it is, and I will suit myself as to, when I pay a price for value and when I don't. In other words, I don't really believe it's objective. And that's why repeatedly Lewis comes back to the question of death for a good cause. He keeps coming back to this ancient Roman writer Horace, who said, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori." It's sweet and seemly to die for your country. And Lewis keeps coming back to this, not because he says that self-sacrifice or martyrdom is the only value, but because it's the question which shows the issues at stake in the starkest light. Because for as long as we don't have to pay a price for our belief in a certain value, it's not necessarily going to be clear to us that we really do believe in its objectivity. It's just convenient. It just suits us. But when we have to pay a price for it, well, then it's revealed to us whether we really believe it to be objective or not. And, I just gave the 2 examples of honesty and chastity. And they're sort of lower down the scale than, actually putting your life on the line, literally in battle. And the question as to whether it's sweet and fitting or sweet and seemly to die for your country is the experimentum crucis, Lewis says. It is the critical experiment of your belief in objective value. Because, subjectively, it's not going to do you much good to die on the battlefield in defense of your country. You will lose everything.
Right.
But you will not have lost your honor. And that's where belief in objective value reveals itself in the lives and deaths and injuries of people who go into battle in defense of a good cause. And that's why, quite rightly, we honor our veterans and we honor the dead who have laid down their lives for us, because they paid the ultimate price. Subjectively, it didn't do them any good. Right. But objectively, it was the right thing to do.
So this is what's interesting, because as I think through Lewis's argument, and I think about a book by Carl Trueman, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, a very interesting book, a really helpful book for me personally. There is a technological aspect to all of this that as far as I understand, I'm interested to hear what you have to say about this. Prior to maybe the Industrial Revolution, people were more maybe incentivized by nature to believe in, let's just say, the way or the Tao or just that objective reality, because it's like you didn't have air conditioning, you're going to just like, you're going to get really hot. Or if you don't, if you don't have a heater, there's just the elements of the natural world were imposing on people constantly. They didn't have all the luxuries that we have today. And so then the Industrial Revolution comes along and we just start building everything and making things a lot more comfortable and a lot easier, and travel is easier. And we don't, I'm in my air conditioned, or I guess my heated house in the middle of winter, and we've got like an April air system so that we have like the humidity it's just ridiculous what we have. And so, like everything, it seems like, is conditioning people to assume whatever is contrary to what Lewis calls the Tao or the way in his second chapter. And so in a sense, like when you go back to the fall and talk about Satan tempting Adam and Eve and saying, did God really say? Like that definitely is, I think it is the same sort of philosophy that Satan is tempting with. The only difference is that from Satan until the Industrial Revolution, there was much more incentive just by natural law to not do that in some sense than there is now. It seems like something fundamentally changed in the 1800s, and we're living in that now. And it does feel like we live in a different world. And maybe that's like what your book title is. Like maybe we're living after humanity in some sense because men have ceased to be men, because Lewis says when you assume this objective reality, you aren't really a man anymore. You're not really a person anymore. Yeah. Any thoughts on that? That's a lot.
No, you're absolutely right that the developments in technology tend to make it more likely that we will be subjectivists. I remember years and years ago when I was still, a boy, a preacher said, who do you think is more likely to pray? A person who is caught in a storm on a lake who is in a rowing boat, or a person who is caught in a storm on a lake in a motorboat?
Yeah, right. That's like a really good way of putting it.
Yeah, because if you've got a motorboat, you just turn the motor on and you zoom out of the storm and you get home quickly. Right. You're relying upon your technology to solve your problem for you.
Yes.
And, this is a question that Lewis raises very explicitly in the course of The Abolition of Man. He says, for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, virtue, and discipline. The cardinal problem for the modern man is how to conform reality to our own wishes. And the solution is a technique. We can bend reality to our wishes much more effectively than people in the past because we have more technological means of doing so. We can fly. We can zoom across a lake with an off-board motor, an outboard motor.
Space.
We can go into space. Yeah, we can do genetic technology on our yet unborn children.
Right.
We can dose ourselves up with, hormone treatments and imagine that we've changed our sex. We can do all sorts of things, which our forebears could not do. But these are only differences in degree. They're not differences in kind. Right. And that's why in the fictional counterpart to The Abolition of Man, which is Lewis's novel, That Hideous Strength, the third book in his trilogy of interplanetary adventures, That Hideous Strength being avowedly, in Lewis's own language, linked to The Abolition of Man. It has behind this novel the serious point that he tried to make in Abolition. In That Hideous Strength, the very title of the novel is a description of the Tower of Babel. So again, we're back in the book of Genesis, where the men of the Tower of Babel built this huge, great tower to the heavens. in order to make a name for themselves, to be like the gods, to be like God. In other words, they were exerting their own power to become more divine and less human. They were, approaching, they hoped, omnipotence, omnicompetence.
Yes.
Not just accepting their own limitations as finite, mortal human creatures, which all of us are, however wealthy we may be and however much access to technology we have.
Right.
This is the problem with growth in technology, that it hides from us very often our own mortality. And we're affronted when we suddenly come up against some incurable illness. We thought, I thought modern medicine could cope with everything. Well, no, it can't. And so you're quite right. In the modern age, since the 18th century, maybe, or even perhaps put it back to the 16th century, Lewis wrote a big fat book about the 16th century and studied some of the earliest origins of this change. We are much more likely to be subjectivists. But the same problem has accompanied us right from the very start of human history.
So let me ask this question about the history of this, because when I don't even know how to think through this. It feels very blurred in my brain. The idea that there is, so technology in and of itself, I don't think is inherently evil. And I don't think there's anything in the Bible that would say that. That said, it can very easily turn evil and be used for evil. And so you think of the history of the West and how the West brought about the Industrial Revolution in a lot of ways. Western philosophy in some ways and in some ways not, but like just that flow of thought and history brought about the American Revolution and then the Industrial Revolution, and now what we have today in the West, which is like a very globalized world, and it feels very small. But when I look back to like early architecture in England and the way that the people used to build and create, there seemed to be something that was much more natural about it. Think of like brick and wood and stone compared to our concrete and, metals and things like that we build with today. And so I don't know if there's a real answer to this, but like, what's the line between using the technological powers that we have to advance something that is good and that is in accordance with the objective worldview, and then using our technological powers towards things that I think, using architecture as an example, that seem to be contrary to what is objective and true and real. Because you go into cities, at least in the United States today, and I'm not sure if it's this way in England, but in the United States, where everything's glass, everything's concrete, there's rarely wood, there's rarely brick, there's rarely stone, and you feel weird. I feel weird. I'm like, this all feels like dystopian and strange and anti-human. And so like, how do you use technology in a way that is like, you're discerning what's good and true rather than allowing for it to almost take you over and destroy you? And yeah, go guys, try to answer that, I guess.
Yeah, another massive set of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
And those are really the sorts of questions that Lewis gets into a little bit more in the third chapter of The Abolition of Man, where he's talking about technology and science, and he's saying at one point, he says rather ruefully at one point, nothing I can say will prevent some people from claiming that this is an attack upon science. And he says it is not an attack upon science. It is an attack upon the misuse of science, which is quite a different thing. Now, how you adjudicate between proper uses of science and misuses or abuses of science, I mean, that's a massive question, which Lewis certainly doesn't get into in any detail. Mm-hmm. But the sort of principle underlying his whole approach is that you must not use science and technology in ways which affront the natural law, the Tao, the way, the objective values of goodness, truth, and beauty. That ought to be obvious, that you should do the good and avoid the evil. But of course, people will debate about exactly where the line between the good and the evil lies. And, Lewis is not saying that all these questions are easy. To bring it back to the very opening question about the waterfall, some said it's sublime, some said it was pretty. Now, there are mere trickles of water, which you should not describe as sublime. Not all waterfalls are sublime, but surely the Niagara Falls, the Victoria Falls, the Iguazu Falls are pretty darn sublime. If that word means anything, it means that kind of waterfall.
Right.
And there are little trickles coming out of the stream at the bottom of your garden, which are, if anything, just pretty. And then there are intermediate waterfalls, neither especially grand nor especially little, which, we would have to argue about what is exactly the best term for it. And so, hence we get into all the debates that there are in all these areas.
Yes.
The real question is that Lewis is tackling in The Abolition of Man is the fundamental one. Do we really believe that there is a correct answer to which we can approach more nearly by means of this debate? Are we actually arguing about the truth of the matter, or are we really just engaged in a power struggle? Are you, in other words, just going to try to overwhelm me with your viewpoint through, force majeure, through strong-arm tactics, through, propaganda, obliterating my viewpoint by denying me access to the airwaves or to print or to, denying my freedom of speech? Yeah. Are you going to use that as your tactics in the argument, or are you going to sit back relaxedly and say, I could be wrong, prove me to be wrong, and I will try to prove that you are wrong? And, the free flow of ideas. Now, if that's the situation, that's good, that's right, that's proper. That's the free inquiry, that's following the argument wherever it may lead. And you and I, we might differ over the answer, but we are agreed on the rules of the game. And that's the situation that Lewis wants to preserve. In other words, he's wanting to preserve a respect for reason. But as soon as you give up on reason, then it's all a question of power, the will to power.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so very anti-human, because you're in the law of the jungle if it's all about power and not about truth. Might is right. And once you're in that situation, well, to quote one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite films, The Mission, if might is right, love has no place in the world.
Yeah. I mean, that's totally right. I mean, even as you're speaking, I'm thinking of like the way there seems to be two ways in which people are beginning to go. And I'm trying to think through this a little bit in recent times, just because of how crazy things are politically right now. And like everything's kind of crazy, even technologically. We're trying to create AI systems and people don't fully understand what those are, but they're built on language, which gives them some sense of, I don't know, gives them some metaphysical reality or something like that. And then there's a huge shift in the church of people going back to some of these older traditions that are Anglican, Catholic, high church, older traditions that seem to be in certain ways more in line with liturgical worship and things like that. Now, I guess I'm interested in Lewis's maybe prophetic vision of AI. And I'm not saying that he specifically speaks of this in The Abolition of Man. He didn't say we're going to have artificial intelligence and large language models, but it seems like that's sort of the direction in which subjectivism will go, is into the technological advancement into something that's sort of actually like a god. Like you described the motorboat and the person like in the rowboat. In some sense, the motorboat becomes I don't want to say it becomes a god, but it becomes something that is you're fully dependent on and reliant upon in that situation. And you put your faith and your trust in it to get you to where you want to go. And it seems like AI is kind of that thing for a lot of people and what they're trying to build and create. Elon Musk was just on Joe Rogan talking about how he kept saying that that AI is all knowing, like kind of these like theological terms like that we would use for God, not for technology. And that is freaky. First off, it's scary, but then it seems to sort of affirm what Lewis is saying in that these, like you were saying, that the subjectivist worldview devolves into a power game in which the person who is, and you even talk about it in your book, kind of the group protesting the loudest wins. And so if you can create a being that is fully technological, but that is quote unquote all knowing, that can control the narrative fully and completely, like, isn't that just a counterfeit logos? Like what John 1:1, like, isn't that like, that seems to be different from even anything that's been created in human history. And I'm very nervous about that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, you're quite right. Lewis doesn't really say much about artificial intelligence. I mean, the computer hardly existed in his day. However, in That Hideous Strength, the novel version of the argument,
yes,
he does present effectively an artificial intelligence, which is it's very gruesome. It's the decapitated head of a French criminal called Alcazan. And this head has somehow been obtained and it's been kept alive. It's been fixed on a bracket on a wall and it's fed with tubes and air and liquid, and it somehow retains its mental functioning. Wow. But it's obviously hideous, that hideous strength. It's the ultimate kind of idol.
Yeah.
And what Elon Musk, I think, is describing when he talks about, the all-knowing AI, which we are eventually going to arrive at, is an equivalent of that. It's an imitation God. It's an idol. It's something that we find ourselves obeying when we should not, because it is folly to obey something which we have made. It is God who has made us and not we ourselves. We are the creatures and his children and the creatures of his hand. Yeah. And, you only have to go back to the Old Testament. Is it Isaiah who says, or is it in the Psalms, they make their idols, they have eyes but see not, they have ears but hear not, they have mouths but speak not. Now you can get an AI-generated image of a person who does seem to be seeing and hearing and speaking, but it's all a trick.
Yeah,
it's all generated artificially. It's not real. It can almost convince you that it is real, but it's something we have made. It's something less than ourselves. And why would we worship something less than ourselves? We should worship God, who deserves our worship because he has made us and saved us and is redeeming us and is the source of all goodness, truth, and beauty, rather than our own little fake versions of him that we have conspired to generate.
Yes. So do you think that Lewis, if he were alive today, seeing what's happening with AI and, one, even the computing power, I think it doubles every 6 months. And so these AI systems are becoming, let's just say, better and better, or worse and worse, depending on how you look at it. But they're becoming more and more convincing to a lot of people. And even like if you're on social media and you see a picture or video, you always have to ask yourself, is this real now? Which you didn't have to do that 5 years ago. And I think in 1 Thessalonians, it talks about in the end, maybe it's not Thessalonians, somewhere in the New Testament, it talks about in the end, people will not be able to tell what's real and fake, and it'll be kind of chaotic. And so if Lewis were alive today, would he see these AI systems as the final step in the abolition of man, and as a fulfillment of some of the prophecies foretold in the Old Testament and obviously in Revelation, and we're getting apocalyptic here, but it's interesting. Would he see these systems as the end of just another end of a world in the same way that Babel was an end of that world? Or would he see this as we're getting to the end of like the world, the last battle where we all enter into heaven, and if we can make it through the trials and the test of what's to come? What do you think he would say?
Well, I think he would say that this is, getting towards the ultimate extreme of the chain of logic that he's sketching out for us in the Abolition of Man. That once you've been able to devise through techniques a very, very convincing human being through artificial means, then you have almost become God. You have almost achieved the aim of the men of the Tower of Babel. Of course, but of course, the actual aim is to become God, not to become as God. Right. And of course, we can't become divine under our own steam through the assertion, the exercise of mere power. We become divine by baptism and by the process of gradually loving and serving and obeying God in Christ. And that's how we participate in the divine attributes. To quote one of the letters of St. Peter, we become partakers in the divine nature through that kind of process, not through assertion of our own willpower. So the aim of life is to become God, to become divine, to become like God, in God. Right. In him we live and move and have our being. That's the whole purpose of the Christian life.
Right. Paul say,
sorry?
Oh, I was just saying, Paul says, not I, but Christ in me. And then obviously Jesus, one of his commands is be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And a lot of low church non-denominationalists really don't like that one. I grew up in that world, the be perfect one. I always heard growing up like, well, that's not actually, Jesus doesn't actually mean that. But the more that I've studied theology, like I think he actually does mean that.
Yes,
but
he certainly does, because we can't go and live with him in heaven unless we're perfect, unless we're perfected in sanctity. And that's a long and painful process.
Yes.
God doesn't just wave a wand and lie to himself and says, you're perfect even though I know you're not. That would be God just willing something through his own power rather than making it in reality. So Lewis, with his own high Anglicanism, you mentioned high Anglicanism, Catholicism, and so on. He had a high natural theology and had a high belief in not just imputed righteousness, but infused righteousness, that God will actually communicate his nature to us as we open ourselves to it ever more fully. That's the whole purpose of the Christian life. But to bring it back to, much more mundane questions, as opposed to, the final apocalypse and the man of lawlessness described in the letter to the Thessalonians.
Yes.
It's interesting to me that a question that Lewis does raise, albeit briefly, in the Abolition of Man, and which is quite central, actually, to that hideous strength, is the question that most Christians don't want to talk about at all, and that's contraception.
Yeah.
Now, that, for Lewis, I think, was a really live issue. And it's really, in some ways, the central theme of the Abolition of Man, of that hideous strength, which opens with the word matrimony. Now, matrimony is often taken as a complete, synonym for marriage, but the two words are not exactly the same, because matrimony refines marriage and defines it in connection with motherhood. Marriage is the state in which women are made into mothers.
Right.
That's the nature of the relationship. It's not just men and women being friends. It's men and women being sexual partners so as to generate the next generation,
Right.
to make the woman into a mother, in other words, and indeed to make the man into a father, but that's sort of taken for granted. And in the trilogy of interplanetary adventures that Hideous Strength is the culmination of, the first two volumes take you to Mars and Venus.
Yes.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Lewis outlines the principles of masculinity and femininity in those first two books. And then in the third book, he brings them down to earth, almost literally, in this mundane marriage of two young people, Mark and Jane, who have a contracepted relationship. And their marriage is very unhappy. But by the end of the book, spoiler alert, they give up on contraception and they make love and they procreate. And so do all the other married couples, and indeed all the beasts. There's a grand lovemaking session at the end of the book, and new life is born into the world, but naturally, properly, holistically. This is not manufactured life. It's not reproduction. It's procreation. There's a significant difference between those two words. But most Christians in the last 100 years or so, I think it must be said, have basically accepted contraception as something that is okay.
Yeah.
But until 1930, less than 100 years ago, in fact, most Christian denominations around the world still adopted the traditional Christian view that there should be no barrier between a man and a woman between the husband and wife in the sexual act. If you wanted to space your family, if you wanted not to have children, then you exercised self-control. Who would have thought it? The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And we now farm out our self-control to drugs and devices and methods so that we can have sex with as many people as we like without ever having to fear the problem of fertility.
Yes.
In other words, we are using a technique to bend reality to suit our own wishes.
And this is, I mean, exactly why all the birth rates are so low in the West. I mean, the United States is like 1.6 right now or something, and that's a dying civilization. It's almost suicidal. If you want to think about it that way, it's not good. And it is interesting because that's just, again, like growing up, I was born in 1999. So contraceptive, that nobody even, it was assumed like, do whatever you want, have as many kids as you want. And what that turned into was like, okay, my grandparents grew up in families with like 10 kids. And then it went to like, okay, we're going to have like 2 or 3. And then now a lot of people in my generation are having no kids. And you have these marriages that are falling apart after 5, 6, 7 years. People are getting divorced or just not getting married to begin with because there's such a stark disagreement on what I've noticed is a lot of men want to have children, but a lot of women do not because of the feminist movements and women being told that it's oppressive to bear children, which is the exact opposite. It's liberating and good to do. But it's really like that whole, you're right. Nobody wants to talk about that. And the churches and a lot of churches have just kind of decided we're just going to kind of go with the worldly narrative here and kind of just do what they're telling us to do. And because if we tell people that they can't control how many kids they have, then they're not going to be able to pursue their other dreams. When it feels like Lewis is saying your dreams are not whatever your dreams are that are not in alignment with procreation are kind of wrong, and you should like put those back where they belong and hope for the future. And by the way, it's like difficult. Like my wife and I have been married 4 years. We have 3 kids. Our oldest just turned 3. And like you give up a lot of freedoms. I'm 26. My wife is 26. We don't go and hang out with friends on weekends. We change diapers and listen to crying. It's in a lot of ways. I love it. And I wouldn't change it for the world because I love my kids and there's so much meaning and purpose in it. And I wouldn't change it to be able to go, to the bars or whatever people are doing now. but until you do it, you don't really understand the value of it. And it's one of these mysteries in life that I think is a wholehearted act of faith, because the more you try to articulate it to someone, the less it really makes sense to the person who doesn't actually have children in that way. And so, all that to say, that's actually really interesting what you say about the Ransom trilogy, and that it's the whole point that Lewis is trying to make is like get married, have kids, which is kind of like a really basic thing. But in our culture, that's become an outline. Like that's a bad thing to tell people to do this. I remember, and I'll be quiet after this, but I remember when I was like 19 or 20, I was at Chick-fil-A with a friend. I don't know if you know Chick-fil-A. I don't know if they have those in England, but and we were talking, and both of us single, and we're talking about, okay, we got to find a wife, we got to figure out how to do this, get married. And we're just talking, and I'm loud, and some lady was sitting next to me, an older woman, and she like looked over at us, and she's like, how old are you? I think she asked how I was, like 19, 20. And I told her, yeah, I was 19, 20. She was like, well, you shouldn't be talking like that. Go have fun. Go enjoy your life. Wait till you're in your 30s to have kids. And I think I shot back something probably disrespectful, and I probably shouldn't have said it, but I was just like, why would you even say that to me? Like, I'm trying to do the right thing, and you're supposed to be like an elderly lady who's, I would hope, would give me some wisdom and insight. And your wisdom and insight is upend all of the created order and ignore what is good. And that seems to be, I think in your book, or in the Abolition of Man, you talk about the blindness passed through the generations. And like I've seen that, and young people try to look for wisdom and guidance in older people, and the wisdom and guidance that they're being told is do everything that is contrary to what is natural and good and right, and hope that you'll find some sort of meaning in that. And the problem is you can't erase that. You can't go back and redo it. If you're 35 and you're a woman and you haven't had kids, or if you're 45 and you're a woman, you haven't had kids and gotten married because you've climbed the corporate ladder and now you're making six figures, but you don't have a husband, you come home to an empty house, and then you retire and somebody easily replaces you in that corporation and you're sort of forgotten. That's the most depressing thing you could possibly imagine. That's why so many 60-year-old women are depressed, and a lot of them suicidal, who are in that's kind of what they pursued. But there's no stop to it. And so I guess maybe my final question would just be, like, how can the church and how can Christians encourage people? Because I'm Christian, and I know Lewis wasn't making the argument specifically for Christians, but like, I think the church has a responsibility here. How can we encourage people back into the way, or the Tao, or whatever we want to call it, objective reality, in a world that is full of distractions and competing narratives and power narratives that to young, dumb people like myself, like seem to be, they're enticing. Like, what do you do to compete with that? What does Lewis say to do?
Well, if we take the message of that hideous strength, we, as you put it, we get married and have children.
Yeah.
We just do it. We we opt out of the rat race, and we return to a much more natural and organic way of pursuing human life. But I would want to slightly refine the sort of summary statement. It's not just get married and have children, because,
Right.
of course, some couples can't have children.
Yes.
And that is a great tragedy, which is often an absolute burden for them. And some couples have children who are terribly disabled. Or, some couples, to choose a terribly topical example, have children who grow up to murder them.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
It's
right.
This is when we say get married and have children, this is not a panacea. This is not, do this and everything will be fine. Do this and you will avoid the dehumanizing tendencies of a subjectivist mentality. And you will be human, which means you will suffer. in all sorts of ways, which you cannot control. But if you go the subjectivist way, if you try to control through your own willpower all the vicissitudes and the difficulties of life so that you don't suffer, well, you'll find that that's actually less good in the long run, because it will just subtly allow a different kind of suffering to sneak in underneath. Because there's no avoiding suffering in this life. We've got to choose the right kind of suffering. And the right kind, for most people, not for everybody, not everybody is called to marriage. I'm a single man. I have no wife. I have no children. And that's fine. Lewis is not saying everybody must get married, everybody must have 17 children. He's not saying anything like, that's such a crude sort of caricature of this kind of advice. All Lewis is basically saying is what has been said down through the generations by Christians, and not just Christians either, but get married, be open to having children. That's the thing, be open. And if children come your way, praise the Lord.
Yes.
And if they don't, praise the Lord. He will have some other thing for you to do and to be than to be a biological parent. So it's interesting in that hideous strength. There's a couple called the Dimbles, Mr. and Mrs. Dimble. And it turns out that they are infertile. They can't have children. But Mr. Dimble is a university professor, and he brings into his household, and so does his wife, any number of young people to make a sort of a different kind of family.
Yes.
A chosen family rather than a biological family. And that's great.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm, in addition to being an academic, in engaging with young children, young people all the time, I'm also a priest. So I have a sort of spiritual fatherhood.
Yes.
Which I'm able to exercise, which I'm very grateful for.
Right.
But the point is that all of us, in whatever vocation we have, should be bringing new life into the world through whatever means are available to us, and we shouldn't be willfully closing down those channels just because they're inconvenient to us, because we're afraid. I mean, it's natural to have fear. But, one of the commonest commands in the scriptures is fear not, do not be afraid. And so I think that's the sort of spiritual mindset undergirding Lewis's whole philosophy in The Abolition of Man, and indeed undergirding his novelistic treatment of these ideas in that hideous strength. We don't need to fear because, as Jesus says, I have overcome the world.
Yes.
Lewis ends one of his works with that very phrase, fear not, little flock, for I have overcome the world.
I totally agree with that stuff. The interesting thing is that basically, and tell me if this is right, but you're saying, regardless of whether or not you can have kids, you have the responsibility to take on fatherhood and motherhood in some way. And that's, even Paul, it's interesting because Paul is like, I'd rather you all not get married so you can be fully devoted to Christ and fully devoted to the ministry. But some of you got to get married. And so, and Paul is like, he wrote the majority of the New Testament. He's a very important figure. And so there is, that is interesting. The other interesting thing, even the paradox of the abolition of man and what you're saying right now is, you would think, especially me, because it's like my personality, that C.S. Lewis would be like, okay, we need to build a massive a weapon of mass destruction and destroy the AI systems and just blow everything up. And that's just not the answer. The answer is like, just continue to be ordinary, God-fearing, God-loving Christians. Do what the Bible says. Believe it for what it says. Don't let the subjectivist worldview interpret the Bible for you, but take on the objective world view and interpret the Bible for what it means and live in accordance with that. And because Christ has already overcome the world, they can build the biggest Babel they want. It's not really going to make a difference. And that's just, it's always interesting to me. It's very, it's when I think about it, it's very, the word I'm thinking is peaceful. It's very peaceful, which is strange because the way that this book left me feeling after I finished reading through it to prepare for this was not peaceful. But this conversation, it's ending peacefully because it's like you just have kids. You continue to do what God says. And there's a sense in which it's like you don't need to build a weapon of mass destruction to end all of this chaos. You just do the right thing. You tell the truth. And it's the less grandiose answer than the people like myself who grew up in the expressive individualist world want to hear, but it's the exact thing that we should hear. So it's really good.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think what you say about ending on a note of peace is interesting because at the end of the Abolition of Man, at the end of the argument, Lewis has just taken you down the line of logic to, the painful end where you've abolished your humanity, and it ends. The main argument ends on a sad note, on a very downbeat note.
Yes.
But in that hideous strength, it ends on a very peaceable note because Mark and Jane have overcome their subjectivism, and they are now embracing each other fully, wholeheartedly, unafraid of what might come. I mean, they still know that they might be in for a lot of pain and suffering, but they're now willing to go in that direction together because they realize that's how to fulfill their humanity, as opposed to just limiting it to that particular attitude, which is going to give you the easiest way through life. It's very self-preservational, preservative kind of mentality that they've escaped, and so they enter into the peace and joy of the Lord, if you want to put it in Christian terms. I mean, that hideous strength, although a Christian novel is not browbeating you with its Christianity, I think it's a novel which all people ought to be able to read and enjoy.
Yes.
And I heartily recommend it. And I also put in a word for, if people have read the Ransom trilogy but don't yet feel they have a grasp on it, there's been recently a very good book come out just a year ago called Life on the Silent Planet. It's a book of essays, 12 essays. I've got one of them in the book.
Oh, yes, I saw this.
Life on the Silent Planet. It's edited by a chap called Rhys Laverty. It's published by the Davenant Press. And that's very useful if people want to get more into this. And if people also want to explore more on C.S. Lewis and contraception, I wrote a short article in First Things a few years ago. You can get that easily with a few clicks of the mouse. It's online. C.S. Lewis on contraception in First Things, just outlining some of Lewis's thinking on that subject. Because, as we've said, most Christians don't give a second thought to contraception. They just think, oh, that's okay. My parents, my grandparents, used contraception, so obviously I'm going to. Why would I not? And it does require a complete revolution in one's whole attitude to one's body, to one's marriage. It's very challenging.
And to our relationship with God as the one who decides whether or not the act is going to produce a child. You know, it's like, that was a big thing for me as my wife and I discussed it. I was like, it just feels very much like I'm trying to usurp God's power and control and sovereignty over the situation. And that seems wrong for a lot of reasons. And so, we've had a lot of conversations about that. It's very interesting. Oh man, there's so many things. I need to buy that book, Life on Silent Planet, because I looked at that a couple months ago, and then I was like, I need to buy it, and then I just didn't. So I need to do that. The Abolition of Man. I mean, this is a really good conversation. I appreciate you doing this. There's a million more questions we could probably discuss, but I feel like this is ending on a very good note. So for people like, do you have any other work that you've done? I know you've written Planet Narnia. Any things any place that you would lead people toward to find more of your work and what you've done?
While we're on this subject of marriage, there's a book that came out a few years ago called Women and C.S. Lewis. And And I've got an essay in that too, which also explores some of these questions around contraception and why I think Lewis became interested in it as a topic. I mean, it was in the first third of the 20th century, a massive topic, contraception. Everybody was talking about it. It was at least as hot a topic as now transgender issues are for us today. And then it was basically decided in one direction.
Right.
Contraception is okay, and even most Christians went along with it. And certainly in the Protestant world, nearly everybody went along with it. And in the Catholic world, where officially contraception is still a bad thing, which Catholics are not meant to practice, a lot of Catholics, just ignore the teaching of the church. Right. But I would point people to, I mean, I'm not trying to proselytize people to become Catholics on this question, but just to rethink the question. There are two very good documents by popes on this question. The one that came out in 1930 is called Chaste Marriage, Casti Connubii. And the one that came out in 1968 is called Humanae Vitae, on the transmission of human life. And again, with a few clicks of the mouse, you can find these encyclicals. And they lay out why the Catholic Church maintains this viewpoint about the necessity to remain open to human life in the marital embrace, which, it must be said, all Christians, Catholic, Protestant, Eastern, whatever, all Christians basically held to this viewpoint until the 1930s. So less than 100 years ago, all Christians were on the same page about this. And it's worth getting back to that question. And I think when you do, a lot of other questions, which we wrestle with, about, say, transgenderism, redefinitions of marriage, those questions become much more soluble once you address this underlying fundamental question about the nature of the sexual embrace. Because it seems in many ways, contraception seems, of course we would contracept. It's so convenient. It's such a good thing. And of course, in many ways, it is good. But the question is not whether it's good. The question is whether it's the best.
Right.
And God calls us to, the highest destiny, not just to, the second best, but to the very best.
No, that's interesting. And that you mentioned C.S. Lewis and women. One of the things that I thought of, which is, I think, unique to C.S. Lewis, is the way that he portrays women in, especially Paralandra, the way that he shows the fall, vanity. He shows vanity. The lady, the green lady, I can't remember. She gets a mirror. And then she just things can begin to really fall apart. And you think about our society and people on their phones taking selfies and pictures of themselves. I even think about the fact that most people in human history just never really saw themselves because they didn't have mirrors, and how that technology created sort of an easier way to engage in vanity and immodesty. But the fact that Lewis can so accurately portray a woman's psychology as it relates to these vices. I don't even know how he does that, because he was married for a couple of years, right? I mean, 4 years. I listened to a Grief Observed, which is a brutal thing to listen to. And that was difficult. But you think to yourself, I'm married. I could not do that. I'm with a woman all the time, and I could not do what he did in explaining the psychology of how does he do that? Do you know?
Well, he was just an incredibly perceptive man and observant person. And it wasn't just about female psychology either, but male psychology too, of course. By the way, this is the book I'm talking about, Women and C.S. Lewis, edited by Curtis and Key. But yeah, I mean, in that Hideous Strength, he's not just sort of snapping his fingers, as it were, at Jane and saying, have children. He's snapping his fingers at Mark as well and saying to Mark Studdock, become a father.
Yes.
And there are ways in which, the female genius gets corrupted.
Yeah.
And there are ways in which the male genius gets corrupted. And it's interesting that the logo for the villainous NICE, the National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, which is where all the bad guys are, the logo for that institute is a muscular male nude grasping a thunderbolt. In other words, it's a picture of power, of almost of rape. The human, the male body, chiseled to perfection, and now just dominating the rest of humanity and nature more generally with its own superior power. So it's another example of how this subjectivism leads to a Nietzschean will to power, the Übermensch. And I think it's terribly, it's tragically interesting that people are not just on their phones. They're now on their phones taking photographs of themselves, especially young men, jacked up young men, often naked or nearly naked, posing with their muscles. Oh, you've become terribly physically strong, but morally, you're absolute weakling. And that is, a real tragedy.
That is why I can't go to the gym half the time. It's like most guys at the gym are just taking pictures of themselves. And I'm like, if I took a picture of myself, I would be so ashamed. I would be like, I can't do this. I'm so ashamed. It's the way that you're describing that hideous strength reminds me in some ways. Have you read East of Eden by John Steinbeck? So Samuel Hamilton, sort of the good patriarchal figure in that book. He's kind of a good father, a good husband, and sort of voice of wisdom. And I haven't finished the book fully, but I listen to it whenever I have a chance. And there's the scene in that book where, goodness, I forget the names of the characters. I think Adam Trask has these two twins and his wife, I think, she's like a really evil woman. I think she killed herself or something. She ends up leaving, or I think she kills herself. And so he's left with these twins, and he does not know what to do with them. And he's not being they don't even have names. He didn't even name them. And Samuel Hamilton gets word of this, and he lives near Adam Trask, and he goes to Adam and he's like going to convince him, like, you gotta like be a father to these kids. And he kind of like, I don't want to say, I don't know. He uses his masculinity, I think, in that scene, in a way that Steinbeck describes as Samuel almost surprised himself. He kind of like punched him. They got into like a little physical altercation. He's like, you need to be a father. And the fascinating thing about what you're saying about these guys who are like massive muscles taking pictures of themselves, but they're morally weak and they don't have any substance. They don't have a chest. And like a lot of those guys, I know certain people like this, and they wouldn't have what Samuel Hamilton has in them to call somebody who's not fulfilling his responsibility as a father into being a father. And in that sense, it was rough and tumble. He kind of hit him, but then Adam Trask even thanks him for that later on. And I imagine Samuel Hamilton is kind of like a beer belly, kind of a big guy. He's not like ripped or anything. And so it's just fascinating because that's the real man is the one with the children and the wife who knows when to use his physical masculinity to bring about what is good. And the fake man is the one who's chiseled and ripped and looks great, but doesn't know how to use his masculinity at all. It doesn't even have masculinity. It's a very strange thing that I think our culture doesn't understand at all. Everything's so image focused. So anyways, I don't know if that resonates at all, but that just is what that reminded me of, Samuel Hamilton. And it's interesting that Steinbeck is able to portray that very well, because I'm not sure, I don't know really anything about him. Was he a Christian? Do you know anything about him?
Don't know.
I don't know either. It's fascinating. So something to think about, I guess, for people. But anyways, so we can wrap this up. Really, I appreciate all this time. An hour and a half. I know we only plan on an hour. But any final concluding thoughts, encouragement for people after reading The Abolition of Man, maybe, or any concluding thoughts from you?
Well, I would just encourage people to reread The Abolition of Man, reread the Ransom trilogy, and indeed, if they haven't yet read Narnia, read the Narnia Chronicles, because there's a lot in Narnia which is basically propounding the same moral vision, but much more accessibly for a younger readership, as you get in these more adult works. I mean, we could have had a whole podcast about The Abolition of Man in Narnia, because it's there too. We're about to get, next Thanksgiving in America, you're going to get a new version of the Magician's Nephew story. And the magician in that story is himself a kind of Tower of Babel figure who's willing to break the natural law. He's willing to do anything that he can in order to do anything he wants. He's a prime example of the man of lawlessness, the one who's overthrown the Tao, the way, has no respect for natural law. So it's there in Narnia too, and it'll be interesting to see how Greta Gerwig, the director, makes that story. I hope she does it faithfully. She did a very good adaptation of Little Women a few years ago, and I'm hopeful she may do similarly with The Magician's Nephew. We'll see.
You told me last time we did a podcast, you said Little Women was good, so my wife and I watched it. I was bawling my eyes out at the end of it, so it was really good. It was, and then we just watched it again. It's kind of a Christmas movie. We kind of watch it around Christmas time, and so that's a phenomenal movie. And Greta Gerwig, and those actresses, the daughters, I don't know how they do it. The whole thing was phenomenal. Even the cinematography and the way that the shots moved, it sort of, and Timothée Chalamet was phenomenal in that. It was just a phenomenal movie. I love that movie. And to what you're saying about The Magician's Nephew, so I have a 3-year-old. We just started reading it. I don't know if he understands any of it, probably not, but he really likes listening to it. And so I'm reading The Magician's Nephew to him, and I've read it 5 times, but man, Uncle Andrew is a ruthless person, and you can see Lewis and his really kind of hatred for this elitist attitude, this elitist, I'm better than you, I can manipulate reality. You really see that in how he describes Uncle Andrew, and it's fascinating. And I'm reading this to my kids, and I'm like, I want my kids to believe this stuff. It's genius how he just incorporates that into the story. And so I'm like, I'm just going to keep reading this to them as they grow up, and hopefully they'll just embed that in their system and believe it. Because it's things that my dad read to me. I didn't know that I believed it, but I totally believe it. That's how I think. And so, Lewis is amazing. Anyways, Dr. Michael Ward, thank you so much for taking time to do this. I really appreciate it. Thank you for writing this guide after humanity, and I hope to talk again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Andy. Bye-bye.